Most cybersecurity videos about data breaches follow the same formula. A company gets hacked, the news reports it for 2 days, everyone's told to change their password, and then the whole thing gets forgotten by the following week. Today, I want to do something different. I don't want to talk about one company getting breached. I want to talk about something much bigger and much stranger, a massive collection of billions of login records that isn't tied to a single company at all, and what that actually means for how we should be thinking about our own security going forward. Welcome to Cyber Safety Brief, where we explain simple cybersecurity advice for everyday Americans. Quick note before we dive in, this video is based on authentic, legal, and publicly available cybersecurity information. Everything here is for awareness and protection only. I'm not going to point you toward any leaked data, explain how to access it, or walk you through anything resembling a technical attack. What I want to do is help you understand what a leak of this scale actually represents, and more importantly, what you should actually do about it. Point 1. What are we even talking about? Let's start with the basics, because the number itself, billions of records, is honestly hard to picture in a meaningful way. Security researchers in 2026 documented an exposed dataset containing an enormous number of username and password combinations, described by multiple outlets as one of the largest collections of login credentials ever found in one place. Now, here's the important nuance that a lot of headlines skip over. In my opinion, this is the part that actually matters most, and it's the part most people never hear. A collection this size isn't usually the result of one company getting hacked and having its entire user database stolen in a single event. It's far more often what's called a compiled dataset, a massive pile of credentials gathered from many different smaller breaches, leaks, and InfoStealer malware infections over months or years, all combined into one searchable collection. Think of it less like a single burglary and more like someone slowly collecting lost keys from hundreds of different houses over a long period of time, then organizing them all into one giant filing cabinet. The scale is what makes it newsworthy. The method is what makes it dangerous. Point 2. Why compiled doesn't mean harmless. I want to push back on a reaction I've seen a lot when stories like this come out. Some people hear it's a compiled dataset, not a fresh hack, and assume that makes it less serious. What most people underestimate is that the opposite is often true. Here's why. A compiled dataset combines credentials from many sources, which means it often includes both old, outdated passwords and genuinely current ones, all mixed together and organized in a way that's easy to search. For an attacker, this is incredibly efficient. Instead of trying to breach one company at a time, they can search a single massive database for combinations tied to a specific email address, a specific company, or even a specific person, and immediately see multiple possible passwords that person has used over the years. In my opinion, this is where the real danger of password reuse becomes obvious. If you've ever used the same password or even a slightly modified version of the same password across multiple accounts, a compiled leak like this dramatically increases the odds that at least one working combination shows up for use specifically. And once an attacker has one working password, they often try it against your other accounts too, a technique commonly known as credential stuffing. Point 3. A real-life example of how this plays out. Let me walk you through how this typically unfolds for an everyday person, without going into any technical exploitation detail. Imagine someone named Mark. He signed up for a small online forum back in 2019 using his personal email and a password he was fond of. Let's say it was a variation of his dog's name plus a couple of numbers. That forum, unbeknownst to Mark, was breached at some point, and his email and password ended up in one of these compiled leak databases. Mark forgot about that forum years ago. He never got a notification because the forum either didn't know it was breached or didn't properly inform its users. Fast forward to now, Mark still uses a very similar password structure for several of his more important accounts, including his email. If his exact old password doesn't work directly, an attacker running an automated credential stuffing attempt might still succeed, because people frequently reuse patterns even when they think they're being careful by changing a couple of characters. The way I look at it, this story isn't scary because Mark did something obviously careless. It's scary because it's an extremely common, almost universal pattern. Very few people have never reused a password or a password pattern across multiple sites. Point 4. How to actually check if you're affected. Let's get practical, because this is the part people actually came here for. There are legitimate, well-established free tools that let you check whether your email address has appeared in known data breaches. These services work by comparing your email against databases of breaches that have been publicly reported and verified without ever asking for your actual password. I'd encourage you to search for a reputable, well-known breach-checking service, one that's been referenced by cybersecurity researchers and journalists for years, and enter your email address there. If it comes back showing you've been part of one or more breaches, don't panic. In 2026, appearing in at least one breach is extremely common, almost the norm rather than the exception. What actually matters is what you do next. In my opinion, the actual test isn't "have I been breached?" because statistically, the answer for most people watching this is probably yes. The real test is, am I actually vulnerable right now because of it, which comes down almost entirely to whether you've reused that exposed password anywhere else. Point 5. The password manager conversation. I know. Use a password manager is probably the most repeated piece of cybersecurity advice that exists. But let me explain why I think it deserves to be repeated one more time with a slightly different angle than usual. What most people underestimate is that the real value of a password manager isn't really about strong passwords in the abstract sense. It's about breaking the pattern of reuse entirely. A password manager generates a completely random, unique password for every single account you have. That means even if one of your accounts ends up in a compiled leak like the one we're discussing, that specific leaked password is useless everywhere else because it was never used anywhere else in the first place. I do not think this is about being paranoid. I think it is about being prepared. Setting up a password manager takes maybe 20 minutes total, and after that, it genuinely does most of the ongoing work for you. In my opinion, the friction of setting one up is the only real barrier for most people, and once that initial setup is done, it's actually less effort than trying to remember and manually vary dozens of passwords yourself. Let me know in the comments if you already use a password manager, or if this is the video that finally convinces you to set one up. Point 6. Multi-factor authentication as your safety net. Here's the thing about massive credential leaks. Even with the best habits, there's always some chance an attacker gets hold of a working password for one of your accounts, whether through a future breach, a phishing attempt, or some other method we haven't even talked about today. This is exactly why multi-factor authentication matters so much, and I want to explain it slightly differently than the usual "just turn it on" advice. Think of your password as the lock on your front door and multi-factor authentication as a second lock that requires a different kind of key entirely. Something you have like your phone, rather than just something you know, like a password. Even if someone finds a copy of your first key sitting in a massive compiled database somewhere, they still can't get through the second lock without also having your phone in their hands. In my opinion, multi-factor authentication is the single most effective safety net against exactly the kind of leak we're discussing today because it assumes your password might already be compromised and adds protection anyway, rather than relying entirely on the password staying secret forever. Point 7. What about old, forgotten accounts? Here's a point I don't think gets discussed enough. What most people underestimate is how many old, forgotten accounts they still have sitting out there. Old forums, shopping sites they used once, services they signed up for years ago and never touched again. These accounts are frequently the ones involved in older breaches feeding into compiled leaks like this one, and they're also the accounts people are least likely to have secured with strong, unique passwords, simply because they never seemed important enough to bother. I'd like to know your opinion here. Do you think it's worth going back and cleaning up old accounts you barely use, or is that just not a realistic use of most people's time? Personally, I lean toward doing a periodic cleanup, even if it's just once a year, specifically because those old, forgotten accounts often still have your real email address and a password pattern attached. sitting quietly in some database you'll never even know about. Point 8. Clearing up the dark web confusion. I want to take a moment to clear up something that gets misunderstood constantly, because I think it actually changes how people should react to news like this. A lot of coverage around massive leaks throws around the phrase, "found on the dark web." And I think that phrase has become almost meaningless through overuse. It conjures up this image of some hidden, mysterious underground marketplace that only sophisticated criminals can access. In my opinion, that framing actually does us a disservice because it makes the threat feel distant and exotic when the reality is much more mundane and, frankly, more relevant to everyday people. Many of these compiled datasets end up on ordinary file-sharing platforms, open cloud storage buckets that were simply left unsecured, or forums that are far easier to find and access than most people assume. The dark web framing makes it sound like you'd need special tools or special knowledge to be affected. The reality is that automated tools attackers use to test these credentials against other websites don't require any special access at all. They're often just scripts running credential stuffing attempts across thousands of sites at once. What most people underestimate is that this is largely an automated numbers game on the attacker's side, not a targeted personal effort against any specific individual. That's actually somewhat reassuring in one sense. You're not usually being personally hunted, but it also means the defense has to be equally automatic and consistent, which is exactly what a password manager and multi-factor authentication provide. Point 9. Does this affect businesses differently? If you run a small business, or you're a freelancer like a lot of the people who watch this channel, I want to spend a moment on why this topic hits differently for you. A leak like this doesn't just threaten your personal email and streaming accounts. It threatens business email accounts, payment platforms, client management tools, and shared logins that teams sometimes use without realizing how risky that shared access actually is. In my opinion, small businesses are often more exposed than large corporations in this specific scenario, not less. Large companies typically have dedicated security teams monitoring for exactly this kind of exposure. Small businesses and freelancers usually don't, which means a compromised password sitting in a compiled leak can go unnoticed for far longer, quietly giving an attacker access to invoicing systems, client data, or business bank accounts. If this applies to you, I'd specifically recommend enabling multi-factor authentication on every business-critical account you have: your email, your banking platform, your invoicing software, your cloud storage. Before doing almost anything else on your cybersecurity to-do list, it's the single highest impact change you can make in the least amount of time. Point 10. A generational pattern worth mentioning. Something I've noticed, and this is admittedly more of a personal observation than a hard statistic, is that password reuse tends to follow a bit of a generational pattern, though it shows up differently across age groups. Older users often reuse the same one or two passwords across nearly everything because they learned to use the internet in an era before password managers were common, and the habit simply never changed. Younger users, meanwhile, often use more varied passwords, but frequently reuse the same base password with small, predictable variations, swapping a number, adding a symbol, changing a single letter, which, as we talked about earlier with Mark's example, doesn't actually provide the protection people think it does. The way I look at it, neither pattern is really about carelessness. They're both understandable responses to the same underlying problem. Humans are genuinely bad at remembering dozens of complex, unique passwords, and until password managers became mainstream, there wasn't a good alternative. This is exactly why I don't think blaming individuals is the right approach. I think the right approach is making the better habit as easy as possible to adopt, which is what tools like password managers and multi-factor authentication actually do. Point 11. What companies should be doing too. I don't want this video to put all the responsibility on individual users, because that wouldn't be a fair picture. What I personally think is that companies holding your login information have a real obligation here too, using proper password hashing and salting techniques so that even if their database is stolen, the passwords inside it aren't usable in plain form, detecting and alerting users quickly when a breach occurs. and offering multi-factor authentication as a standard option rather than something buried in an obscure settings menu. When you're choosing between two similar services or apps, I genuinely encourage you to consider security practices as part of that decision, the same way you might consider price or features. A company that makes multi-factor authentication easy to find and enable is signaling something meaningful about how seriously they take this issue. Point 12. A simple recap checklist. Let me pull everything together into a short, practical checklist you can actually act on today. First, check your email against a reputable breach-checking service. Second, if you find you've been part of a breach, change that specific password immediately and check whether you've reused it anywhere else. Third, set up a password manager if you haven't already, and let it generate unique passwords for you going forward, rather than trying to invent them yourself. Fourth, turn on multi-factor authentication for your most important accounts. Email first, then banking, then anything tied to your business or your identity documents. Fifth, do a periodic cleanup of old, forgotten accounts you no longer use, since these are often the weakest, most overlooked links in your overall security. None of these steps require technical expertise. In my opinion, that's actually the most encouraging part of this whole topic. You don't need to understand how compiled leak databases work technically to meaningfully protect yourself from them. You just need to break the habit of reuse and add a second layer of protection on top. Point 13. The bigger lesson. I want to end with a broader thought because I think it reframes this whole topic in a useful way. A leak of this scale isn't really a single event you can fully protect yourself from after the fact. It's better understood as a snapshot of a much larger, ongoing reality that credentials leak constantly, from thousands of different sources, all the time, and the compiled databases just make that reality visible in one place. In my opinion, that means the goal was never to prevent every possible leak. That's simply not realistic for any individual. The real goal is to make sure that when a leak happens, and eventually, in some form, it probably will, it doesn't actually matter because you were never reusing that particular password anywhere important, and you had multi-factor authentication standing behind it anyway. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this shift in thinking, and I'd genuinely like to know whether you plan to check your email against a breach database after watching this video. Point 13.5. This isn't just an American problem. Before moving to the final thought, I want to note something for viewers watching from the UK, Australia, and Canada, since this channel reaches people across all 4 countries. Compiled credential leaks like the one we're discussing don't respect national borders. A leak sourced from a breach at a company based in one country can easily contain email addresses and passwords belonging to users anywhere in the world, and the automated credential stuffing attempts that follow don't check what country you're logging in from before trying your old password against your accounts. What I think is genuinely useful here is that breach-checking services and password managers work essentially the same way no matter where you're located. The advice in this video isn't specific to any one country's laws or systems. It's really about a global pattern in how credentials leak and get reused by attackers, which means the checklist I gave you earlier applies just as directly whether you're in Chicago, Manchester, Sydney, or Toronto. Point 14. Why I think this story will keep repeating. I want to close with a slightly bigger picture thought because I think it's the most important takeaway from this entire video. Stories about massive compiled credential leaks are not going to stop happening. If anything, I think they're going to become more frequent, not less, simply because the number of online accounts each of us holds keeps growing every single year, and every one of those accounts is a potential future data point in some future compiled dataset. What I personally think is that trying to prevent every leak or trying to keep track of every breach announcement as it happens is not a sustainable long-term strategy for anyone. It's exhausting, and honestly, most people won't keep it up for more than a few weeks before breach fatigue sets in and they stop paying attention entirely. In my opinion, the sustainable strategy is building a security setup that simply doesn't care whether the next leak happens or not, because your passwords are already unique everywhere, and multi-factor authentication is already standing as a second line of defense. I do not think this is about being paranoid. I think it is about being prepared in a way that requires almost no ongoing mental energy once it's set up. That's really the whole philosophy behind this channel. Practical steps that work quietly in the background rather than constant vigilance that nobody can realistically maintain forever. Let me know in the comments if you think leak stories like this one are going to keep getting bigger, or if you think companies and regulators will eventually get ahead of the problem. I go back and forth on this myself, and I'd genuinely like to hear a range of opinions from people watching. If this video helped you understand online safety more clearly, like the video and subscribe to Cyber Safety Brief for more simple cybersecurity advice that actually respects your time and your intelligence. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay safe online. Before you go, comment below whether you found out today that you've been part of a data breach before, and if so, what you're going to do differently starting now.